Welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I am Colin Jones, president of City Club. For more than a century, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. Today, we're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel and are joined by thousands of people via X-Ray FM and its radio stations at 107.1 and 91.1 FM, KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app, and Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for all of the work they do to bring Friday Forum to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our sponsors, volunteers, and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank AARP Oregon, Avangrid Renewables, and SEIU 49 for their generous support of this and all of our Friday Forums this fall. I'd also like to welcome the civic scholars who are here today from Park Rose High School. Please join me in showing our appreciation for everyone who has made this event possible. I am really excited for today's Year in Review Forum. This is a new tradition that I hope will carry on for many years to come. The panel today is amazing, and I feel the best thing I can do right now is to just get out of the way. But let me introduce you to our moderator, Carrie Timchuk. Carrie is the executive director of the Oregon Historical Society, an organization that has been protecting Oregon's cultural legacy for 120 years. A small handful of organizations older than City Club. He has served as Marion County Deputy District Attorney and on the staffs of U.S. Secretary of Labor Elizabeth Dole, U.S. Senator Bob Dole, and U.S. Senator Gordon Smith. He is also a four-time champion on Jeopardy! Please join me in welcoming Carrie, who will introduce our panelists.
Well, I'll take great Portland Civic Clubs for 200, please, Alex, and welcome to the City Club. The Oxford Dictionary proclaimed toxic to be the word of the year. Dictionary.com chose misinformation. The Oxford Children's Dictionary, possibly after watching The Graduate one too many times, says plastic is the word of the year. The CNN quote of the year was Rudy Giuliani's quote, "Truth isn't truth." The great radio commentator Paul Harvey once said, "In times like these, it's always good to remember there's always been times like these." My question after this year, though, is have there ever been times like these? Every day, another big story breaks out of Washington, D.C. about immigration or trade battles or investigations. In November, we saw those news stories translate into high voter turnout and a blue wave in the U.S. House. Economically, the outlook is up one day, down the next. The U.S. creating more jobs every month, but wages failing to grow with them. It's also been a year, of course, of horrific school shootings and attacks by white supremacists continue to be carried out across the country. And many people lost lives and property with those tragic wildfires across the West. Locally, protests and counter-protests dominated the news. Police shootings continue without a lot of answers, and despite the efforts and dollars being put into affordable housing, the housing crisis continues. That's a lot to unpack, I know, but fortunately we're joined by four people who bring unique perspectives to what's happening right now in Oregon and around the world. Rukiah Adams is the Chief Investment Officer at Meyer Memorial Trust. She leads all investment activities to ensure Meyer has the resources to work toward a flourishing and equitable Oregon. She is also the chair of the Oregon Investment Council, which oversees $92 billion of public employee pension funds and state money. No pressure on you there, Rukiah. Patrick Kreitzer is the president and CEO of the Tillamook County Creamery Association, of course, the makers of some of our very favorite products, Tillamook cheese, Tillamook milk, and Tillamook ice cream. Patrick serves on the board of the Oregon Food Bank, the Oregon Community Foundation, and was the chairman for a number of years of the Oregon Business Council. Andrew DeVagal is the co-director of the Masters in Multimedia Journalism program at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication, and the associate director of the Agora Journalism Center, UO's gathering place for innovation and communication and civic engagement. And finally, Matt Dos Santos is the legal director of the ACLU of Oregon. He currently oversees the legal program, which includes a docket of about 30 pieces of impact litigation and about 3,000 requests for legal assistance per year. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. All right, this is going to be a fun exercise as we review the year that has been 2018. It's kind of a lightning round here. We're going to have quick questions, quick answers, and let folks think about 2018, and maybe at the end look ahead to 2019. So we'll begin. For me, one of the most indelible images of the 2018 was that press conference or statement when Meet the Press was on when Mayor Giuliani proclaimed that truth isn't truth. That kind of sums up the whole year in Washington, D.C. What for you was the most indelible image of 2018? Kai, we'll start with you and we'll go down the line.
For me, it was the image of the little girl trying to immigrate to the United States with her mother, looking up and crying and holding her doll. That image just seared into my heart.
Patrick.
So yeah, a lot of interesting images from the year. I'm going to go with a lighter one, the shot of Diego Valeri with his hands on his head when Sebastian Blanco hit that goal in the Kansas City game. I think that one's going to stick with me.
I think the one that's going to connect with me for 2018 is really the images that came out of the campfire in Northern California, and I think it just connects with all these other issues that we need to address, including climate change.
And I think for me, images that I think you already described a little bit of riot gear-clad officers, tear gas, what looked like essentially a war zone in downtown Portland through the eyes of journalists who are out covering protests.
And stay down with you and we'll come back this way. The most inspiring moment of the year for you?
So, this actually is something that recently happened, which was the final immigrant detainees who had been shipped from the southern border with no notice to the federal prison in Sheridan, Oregon, were released. So Sheridan, our federal prison in Oregon, no longer houses any immigrant detainees, thanks in part to a lawsuit that the ACLU brought and the amazing legal work that Innovation Law Lab did in representing the detainees. The vast, vast majority of those detainees were released because they had valid asylum claims, and the immigration courts had to let them go, contrary to what the Trump administration was saying.
I think for me, the moment from this year that gives me hope is probably the results of the midterm elections. Whether locally, with Joanne Hardesty being the city commissioner and the city council, and at a national level having Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as the youngest member of Congress, as well as I enjoy the idea of the rainbow wave that showed up that's going to represent us in the House.
So one of the encouraging moments for me was in late June we opened a new visitor center on the coast of Oregon, and as we were getting prepared to open the doors for on the first day of its new opening, we were looking out the window and we could see a single file line going all the way back to the parking lot, and it was a really overwhelming outpouring of support for what we're trying to do. And the bigger context for that is that agriculture, especially with a lot of what's going on with trade, but generally what's happening in our food system, agriculture is really taking a punishment here economically and otherwise in the U.S. and across the world. And what we're trying to do is engage farmers in the conversation to address some of the challenges around our food systems, and to have people kind of lining up in support of what we're trying to accomplish was really encouraging in that larger context. Of course, for me personally as well, I spent a lot of our farmers' money on that thing, and so I'm glad that I'm not going to get fired because no one showed up. But certainly encouraging from an agricultural standpoint.
I think the kids were the most inspiring part of this year. Teenagers, the Parkland kids, who really, I think, pushed us to be thoughtful protectors of our wealth and our community and our environment. I've loved what they've been up to. Little kids about the environment, teenagers about our political system and gun control. I just have found so much joy in young Americans this year.
Well, Time magazine famously every year for a century has picked a person of the year, the person who, for good or for ill, most impacted the news of that year. This year they famously picked a delegation of journalists Mr. Khashoggi, the staff of the Annapolis paper, some other crusading journalists. Who for you was the 2018 Person of the Year? A group of people or individual?
Ooh,
so.
that's tough. Well, I've already said the kids were inspiring.
Kids?
But I agree with the decision about Jamal Khashoggi. I think he has forced a conversation with us about who we are and what matters. So I would put him at the top of my list.
Well, you talked about most impact, either way. And so, certainly, whether it's the way we're posturing in our relationships with the rest of the world or, approaching longstanding trade relationships or dealing with some of the challenges associated with, significant challenges associated with offering the American dream to the immigrants of the world. Certainly the administration has been incredibly impactful in all of those areas, not necessarily in a positive way. So I'm going with the president.
Well, as a journalism professor, I would have to say that I would agree with Time Magazine's choice for Person of the Year. I think journalism is inextricably linked to the health of our democracy, and I think it's we're in dangerous grounds at the moment in terms of how do we address the populism that's happening globally, and how do we really bring back this idea of speaking truth to power. So I would echo Time Magazine's choice of Person of the Year to really think about the role of journalism and how it's critically important in today's society.
Yeah, I think for me, I have been blown away by Oregon's sort of the group that I would say are like queer or trans youth, and the ways that they've shown up both organizing for their own rights and also standing up for themselves against institutions that attempt to erase them and their identities. And in particular, there have been several cases that, one which we actually may see in 2019 go to the Supreme Court in some of our rural towns here in Oregon, where transgender youth have essentially said, no, I'm here, I deserve the same rights as other youth, and have basically put their lives on blast. So they for me win the sort of Big Heart Courageous Award for this year.
All right, each of you can pick one of the three here. You've got 5 minutes alone with either Mayor Wheeler, Governor Brown, or President Trump. Pick one and give me the best advice you want to give them for 2019.
I have a interesting relationship with Mayor Wheeler. So I would say that I think that I would probably pick of those three President Trump. And if I could have an honest conversation with President Trump, something that I am truly not sure exists, I would really want to know a little bit more about what is motivating his actions. I mean, some of these things that happen, I wake up and I look at Twitter and I think to myself, is this a well-orchestrated ploy to exhaust the resources of people like these panelists who are trying to fight the good fight every day, or is this just like some buffoonery that has led us to this circumstance? And so, I just don't know. And, maybe I would be disappointed when I picked his brain, but I would be interested in having that conversation.
So, top that, Andrew.
I know, that's a tough one. I would say it would be Governor Brown. I think I love the idea of the majority is happening within the state of Oregon right now, and I love to really think about how can we address the division that's happening, not just across the state, in our city, and across this country, is how do we really address the division so that it's really trying to unify us as a community. And because of our ability to, aspirational ability to try to do that with a majority in the state. And I just feel like there's just a really, she's in a good position to really try to unify us as a community, as a series of communities, because Oregon does represent, I think in some ways, a microcosm of what we look like across the state, across this country. So I'd be excited to really look at all the good things that's happening across the state and have that be a lesson for others in America.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Governor Brown as well. I think it's well documented at this point that the state's ability to adequately fund education now and into the future is at significant risk, let alone other important objectives like maintaining the Medicaid expansion. And so we've all seen the projections. It's certainly something I've been pretty involved in over the last couple of years of fiscal deficits that we're looking at, and those are mostly presented without a recession, which I think most people think is coming certainly by 2020. And so, there's nothing more important in my mind in this state today than putting in place a sensible solution that involves tax reform and control of some of these runaway structural costs that are stealing from this generation and future generations, and we're just going to have to deal with that. And my hope is that we deal with that in this session. And I know this is something that I've had this conversation with her. I know it's something she cares about as well. And so, but forming the right balanced solution to that is an existential issue for the state, I believe.
Well, I think the city and the state are well covered. I have a lot of confidence in Mayor Wheeler and Governor Brown. I would get Trump in a dark room, tell him to just shh for 5 minutes, to shut up, no tweeting, and turn on Rachel Maddow and just have her blast. That's all I would do. I wouldn't say anything. Just be quiet, leave the capital markets alone, leave Hillary Clinton alone, shut your mouth.
So none of you picked Mayor Wheeler, so we'll delve in there a little bit. As you look back at the last year, what's the one, either or, the one issue in Portland that you were proud of that we made progress on, or the one issue that you were disappointed that we didn't make progress on?
Can we start at the other end?
Good.
No,
do
I
you want
love
me
that.
to
No,
start? Okay.
please.
I have so many. But I think the thing that I am disappointed that we didn't make more progress on is not just talking about the housing crisis and the number of people who are living on the streets in Portland on any given day, but really addressing that problem with meaningful solutions, right? And so I think year after year, at least in recent years, I've seen a sort of conversation happening in the public sphere about homelessness and the housing crisis, and we just don't seem to be getting anywhere.
So the question was?
The one issue in Portland that we were either proud of we made progress on this year, or that the one that you're disappointed that we didn't make progress on. So, go ahead. Yeah.
Despite you jumping in. Okay. Obviously, there's statewide. It's great to see the clean energy pass. And then there's some challenges around the jury law, non-unanimous jury law. But the issue that I'm most concerned with, especially moving forward, is, and I alluded to this with the vision that we have in our society, is I just hope that there's some resolution and some common ground that we could really address the differences of the protest that's happening across the city this year in terms of white nationalism, and also with the Antifa protests. Are there ways that we could, address that in a very direct way? And I just feel like we've failed in our communities to do that.
Yeah, certainly housing is something that is a frustrating issue that I feel like we're capable of making better progress on. Looking on the bright side, one thing I do see is that a really encouraging and developing conversation around equity and how the opportunity gap and kind of institutionalized inequities are coloring all of these issues, and whether engage with my peers on the private sector who are engaging within their organizations and more broadly on the topic, or looking at some of the social entrepreneurship happening with emerging leaders and Kairos and some of these other folks that are really kind of leading the way and engaging public and private leaders in some of these topics. I'm encouraged by that, and we have a long way to go. But understanding the institutionalized inequities that are producing some of the outcomes that we're talking about here as issues that we need to address, I think is a big step forward, and I'm encouraged to see that.
I would add, I hope that we talk a bit more thoughtfully about our form of government for the city. We keep skirting it, but the outcomes the inequities are structured into the way we govern ourselves, and I hope that we deal squarely with that in the next year. I would say, I think a lot of drivers have become more thoughtful about mobility, so the Lime scooters and the scooters that put people around town that we found so irritating sometimes. I think what it did was sensitize drivers to people using the roads and in the city, not in cars. And that conversation forced us, at least for me, to really look out for people on bicycles and pedestrians. It really changed my point of view about the responsibility I have for care on the street as a driver. So I actually thought that was a really great outcome of the scooters. I like the scooters.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Kerry Timchuk, and I'm speaking with Rukiah Adams, Chief Investment Officer at the Meyer Memorial Trust, Patrick Kreitzer, the President and CEO of the Tillamook County Creamery Association, Andrew DeVagal, a professor at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communications, and Matt Dos Santos, the Legal Director of ACLU Oregon. Whenever I report to my board at OHS, there's a place in the agenda called What's Keeping the Executive Director Up at Night? So as we look ahead, back at this past year, look ahead to this next year, what's keeping you up at night? Rukiah, for you, I might think is there a recession coming with all that you're responsible for with the investments in the stock market?
Right.
And so.
No, that's not it. That doesn't keep me up at night. So a recession is coming.
This just in, a recession is coming, so.
Who knows when, but it will come, and there's a cycle, changes happen, that's the way it is. So we plan for that, that's fine. I think the conversation about how we take care of each other is what keeps me up at night, and the purrs back and forth really bothers me. It doesn't sit well with me, and I hope that we can have a breakthrough in how we talk about it and how we plan for it, how we fund it, with new leadership over the next year. I'm deeply concerned about how we engage with each other on the topic.
Patrick, besides the bovine disease, what keeps you up at night? So.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Rukiah said. I think if you look at all that we have going on positively now, we're looking at a strong economy. We're looking at an engaged and committed private sector, a strong civic orientation, a progressive kind of orientation towards dealing with some of the structural societal issues, and yet we're still yelling at each other and approaching things from a strong partisan and sort of identity group perspective. And I think as a longtime Oregonian and lover of the state, I think we're better than that. And so I hope that what we're looking at forward and what doesn't keep me up at night in the future is some kind of break in that and some sort of prospect for moving forward and better dialogue.
Andrew.
I would say Trump's Twitter feed. I say that half jokingly because I think in some ways that's one thing that journalism is doing wrong, is we spend too much time on that. And this whole idea of, and what does authentically keep me up at night is the eroding trust in the media. And so obviously that's the thing I focus on at the Agora Journalism Center at U of O, is to really, how do we rebuild that relationship between the media and journalism and the public? And the more that we're debating within, in our radically connected environment on social media, the more I think it's eroding that sort of trust. So We're envisioning ways to try to address that and to help rebuild trust with the media, because I think it's a two-way relationship, right, with the public and journalism and newsrooms. So that's what keeps me up at night, is to try to find solutions towards that.
Yeah, I mean, I just couldn't agree more about sort of discourse and the way that we talk to each other as being so incredibly important to a well-functioning democracy. And one of the things that I think we are seeing is a breakdown in our ability to have that kind of conversation, which comes maybe from partisanship, maybe from social media, who knows? So I just want to echo that quickly, but the thing that really keeps me up at night right now is, you know, as a lawyer who has looked a lot at civil rights and issues over the last, you know, 40, 50, 60 years, and landmark cases coming out of the US Supreme Court, looking at the current composition of the US Supreme Court gives me heartburn, insomnia, shingles. I mean, it's bad, and has also forced me into thinking about new strategies around change here in the state. And thankfully, we have an amazing Supreme Court in Oregon, which, you know, now has Justice Nelson, the first African American woman, first African American, but also a first African American woman appointed to the court
This year,
What's that?
January.
Yeah, in January
of
this year.
yeah.
Really an amazing, you know, Lynn Nakamoto, like just really amazing people who have spent their lives fighting for Oregon, who now sit on the highest court of the land.
One of the weeks, last week was an interesting time for me, for someone who used to live in Washington, D.C., to see the Bush funeral and to see all the, you talked again about the discourse, and to see kind of a civility and decency being praised again. Your thoughts, as did you watch some of the funeral and the eulogies, and what were you thinking about? Can we get back to that time? Anybody? Anybody? Optimism? So,
I think we can get to something better, which is that lots of different people contribute to what that more open and loving conversation is about how we take care of each other as Americans. Yes, I do think we can get there. I was struck by the thoughtfulness that came out of all of the comments during the funeral, and the seriousness with which Americans, you know, said goodbye to a president that some of us did not have a lot of nostalgia for. So I was inspired by that. The thing I don't want to do in getting caught in the nostalgia is to paper over some of the things that were really hard about his presidency, particularly for African Americans. There were some really challenging issues there. So on the one hand, I know what the issues are, and they are very painful, and there were consequences to our criminal justice system, a number of other huge systems that drive inequities. But with all that said, I did spend the time to watch his service and try to send him off with the most respectful goodbye that I could as an American. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I don't think it was so much about a glimpse of what it would be like to go back, or to hope to go back to that time, but it did feel to me like a window opened up where people let down, kind of put the fists down and stop fighting for a minute, and, you know, could still have a difference of opinion about that time and him individually as a leader, or what was happening, you know, in the U.S. or the world at that time, but at least not argue about that for a minute, and sort of, you know, talk about the American presidency and what the United States means to the world, and you know, positive and negative. And I think that
is so true. Sorry, I'm jumping in. It's so true. I think the moment of seeing the presidents lined up too helped me remember the seriousness and the earnestness that they bring to the work. Yeah, that image of all of them in the pews, and by all of them, I mean all of them.
Well, and it reinforced for me just that what I believe, which is that there's this massive pent-up interest in engaging with each other and having differences of opinion without without hatred, without dismissing each other's perspectives, and recognizing some of the challenges that we have to deal with. And I believe that's just below the surface, and it needs to come back out. And maybe we saw a little window where we saw some civility for a minute that might allow that to happen.
Andrew.
Looking at the notion of civility, in fact, one of the projects that the Agora Journalism Center is running right now is called Finding Common Ground, and it's really this idea of news organizations, or even just organizations, helping to facilitate conversations to help find common grounds of peoples with opposing views. And there's some notions within the journalism circles that perhaps that's a new evolving role for journalism, right? For journalists, to actually be facilitators of conversation, to help understand each individual's experiences and their own sort of lived experiences and their own perspectives. So I'm really excited by this notion of doing that, because I feel like there is that hope, right, to be able to bring people together with new perspectives so that we can learn from each other moving forward.
Yeah, you know, I probably will regret saying this, but I actually started crying when George W. Bush was eulogizing his father. Like, towards the end, there was this moment where he got really choked up, and it was sort of like a son talking about his father in a way that, I don't know, was just very touching. And then I found myself being like, oh, why are you upset? Like, those guys were such jerks, and they set back, you know, the LGBT community and immigrant rights community like decades and maybe centuries. But what it reminded me of, it was so interesting that you asked me this question, because I was thinking about it so much last week. What it reminded me of was that simple act of human connection, right? Like empathy. And if we can enter into a situation where we allow ourselves to feel empathy for somebody and what their life is, how it's unfolding for them, like maybe we can have the kinds of conversations that we need to have to get us to a place where we, you know, respect, like love each other and whatever that, you know, means. But yeah, I thought that the funeral was, at least at a personal level, was a good reminder that I need to go talk to my neighbors more. Like literally my neighbors, who I don't talk to ever unless they bother me.
If we're sitting here a year from now, December 14th, 2019, what's the one event that you want to be able to say happened? Just jump in if you got one. So.
Well, the Timbers.
Yeah.
All right.
So.
Yeah, I would love a rematch with Atlanta.
So.
You know, I'd like to be sitting up here talking about us having permanently solved the fiscal, structural fiscal issue that our state's facing, and therefore adequately funding education, not just to the basic level that we're not doing now, but to help prepare our children for the future, and which is very uncertain, and also to help to close the opportunity gap that exists for too many children in our state.
And Rukiah is going to take care of the PERS issue, so.
I don't know if I would pick a specific event, but I guess a specific event that came out of the fact that in 2019 we practiced this notion of radical transparency, so that we could actually see the insights of how structures work in our society, whether it's in journalism, whether it's in government, whether it's in campaign finance, right? I mean, is there a way so that we could build on-ramps for people and citizens to participate in these processes of these structures. Again, whether it's processes of journalism or being more active within your government. I would hope that something positive came out of that radical transparency.
I think that I have a lot of hopes for certain outcomes at the Supreme Court next year, but I think that setting those aside for a moment, the thing that would make a really meaningful impact here in Oregon and across the country is for us to come up with some bipartisan legislation that creates a meaningful pathway to citizenship for folks who are in this country undocumented.
We've got kids from Park Rose here today. Oh, students from Park Rose, where are they? Raise your hand. There they are. So we've got some high school students here, Rukai, and you mentioned that the youth was one of your big inspiring moments, whether they were the Marjorie Stoneman students or other students taking action. You've got a group of high school students here. What advice can you give them as they look to the future?
Well, register to vote as soon as you can and vote. We did have a conversation with some of the students before the program started, and they raised some issues that we as adults sometimes forget are important to young people making their way around the city and state. One thing they mentioned that was important to them was that we keep our eye on the minimum wage, and that for the work that they do, they will need to be compensated for their time. So the thinking about entry-level work and compensation is a big deal. Also, they mentioned how they get around town and transportation and supporting TriMet and having bus and rail systems that enable young people to get around the city safely. So I'm super excited to hear their point of view, and it'll sensitize me in 2019 to think about the role of young people, not just in our democracy, but in our cities, in our towns, our homes, our transit and transportation systems. So thank you to the Civic Scholars for really planting some important seeds for 2019.
Yeah, I had a chance to meet with these young women and men before the program, and one of the things that reminded me is, as I listened to what their concerns and priorities were, is that they have this unique position of sort of not being like the rest of us, caught up in the middle of how things should happen or are happening or aren't happening, and just the daily process of trying to make a difference. And so what I found from that conversation is that they bring in this perspective that I think can help us keep clear on the priorities. They talked about climate change, and they talked about immigration, and they talked about some of the things that we know are important and that we're focused on. But as a good reminder for those of us that are caught up in the middle of things, that those are the priorities, and we need to keep sight of that. So my request of them would be to make their voices heard, to continue to make their voices heard, as we've seen, as Rukai talked about and others talked about throughout the country this year, because it's a good reminder for all of us what the priorities need to be, and to stay focused on the prize for the future.
I want to echo the idea of making your voices heard and really elevate it so that you don't allow anybody else to tell your story. It's your story to tell. So be active, participate in your democratic society. And again, we didn't talk much about some of the demise that's happened in our society because of social media and other sort of forms that are controlling how we distribute information. I think young people have the opportunity and the ability to build your own structures so that you could tell your own stories.
Yeah, I think that if I had one piece of advice for young people today, it would be to embrace your idealism in the face of adults telling you that it is unrealistic or impossible. I truly believe that, as we grow up, right, we lose some of that idealism as we're forced to deal with the day-to-day life. But that is I think, a detriment to adult life. And get involved as early as you can, not just to build your resume with organizations that are doing things that you love, but so that you can have lived experiences, and frankly, they will just, I think, help you choose the path that is right for you.
Great advice. For our radio audience, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Kerry Timchuk, and I'm speaking with Rukai Adams, Chief Investment Officer of the Meyer Memorial Trust, Patrick Kreitzer, the President and CEO of the Tillamook County Creamery Association, Andrew DeVagal, the Professor at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communications, and Matt Dos Santos, the Legal Director of ACLU Oregon. We're now going to go to the audience for some questions. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for City Club staff to collect. You may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag #FridayForum. To City Club members who would like to ask a question at the microphone, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less or so. And we'll go to the microphone over here. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Alain Gauthier. I'm a member of the City Club. And my question concerns the growing inequity, which is not just existing here in Portland, but in the state, in the country, worldwide. We tend to rely as a society on the public sector and the nonprofit sector to address these issues. What do you see as possibility of a new level of interaction with the business sector? A new level of interaction, collaboration, and doing things together, not just talking about them, that actually would address this in a more significant way. Thank you.
Patrick, I think that's right up your alley, a new interaction with the business community, which you've been leading that effort.
Yeah, I think what I experience is a business community that's highly engaged and interested in contributing. I think what you're identifying is there are some barriers that we're going to need to break through in terms of how business folks that have so much to contribute in terms of resources, but also innovation and utilization of technology, and frankly, you know, a lot of the economic activity and jobs opportunities that are part of the pathway to resolving this. So, you know, how to break through that, you know, honestly, I wish I knew. I think what we need to do is recognize, I mean, it's a lot of what we've been talking about up here. There are a lot of assumptions. There's assumptions about, you know, the overpowering profit motive, drowning out businesses' interest in utilizing its resources to address these important societal issues. And there are a lot of assumptions about inefficiencies on the public sector or motivations and special interests on the public sector. And I think the first step is we need to break those things down and come at the issues with what I've discovered is a really broad set of common interests and objectives, and then talk about what the right solutions are.
So thank you for the question. I might add that there are areas where I see it fledgling attempts to create these connections. Historically, we've done it through tax policy, so incenting businesses and individuals through tax credits and other mechanisms to drive capital. But the growing movement for social responsibility and investing and impact investing is another way of moving capital to shared outcomes. The third way I think we could probably put more resources toward is educating more people in business. So one of the ways that you transform the way an institution operates is by bringing in new thinkers who have different points of view and have different values, right, who come from different backgrounds. So I know that Phil Knight at Stanford and at the University of Oregon funds business students who go on to do public interest work, so that we don't treat business expertise or quantitative expertise as the domain of business, but that it can be in service to lots of different kinds of things. So that would be another way that I think that people could drive outcomes over the long run, is to have a more diverse group of people have that skill set, and then we'll see it used in broader and different ways throughout our culture.
Thanks, Rukai. I think we have one of our civic scholars might have a question here, so.
Hi, we were just wondering what you guys think how we can bring some more diversity into state and Congress, and what are some steps that we can do to do that?
So, I mean, I think that, and you said state Congress? Oh, state and Congress. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think that it is incredibly important that impacted communities be represented by their government, right? And that is a big gap that exists still at all levels of government, I think, here in Portland and all the way up through DC. I think it actually starts with our schools. We need to have programs that support an education that allows for the kind of engagement that you're talking about and in a life in politics, if you should choose that. I mean, I wouldn't, but you should. But I mean, I think that the other issue is like that we need to encourage young people to participate early, right? By actually considering their opinions, hearing them, and taking action based on those opinions. Because you can't expect, like this goes for an organization like, the ACLU or a business or whatever, you can't just bring a person of color onto your board and expect them to thrive without support, right? They need the support, the institutional support that exists for everybody else. So I think it takes a lot of work, and it starts early, and it requires investments in education and in our youth, from starting in kindergarten, probably.
I want to add the notion of, you mentioned diversity, and not necessarily addressing the state government or Congress, but really, and what I echoed earlier, in terms of building your own structures to amplify your own voices. I would say the same and encourage you and your young colleagues to really think about adding your voice and diversity and diverse perspectives to the news and information ecosystem within your community. And this notion of, if you don't see yourself represented in your local news media, I would encourage you to build your own local news media. To start thinking about how do you create your own information so that you can share that within your community. So, or if not that, how do you collaborate more closely with the local media? How do you participate in a civic community council, if you will, within the local media? So that to me, it's participating, echoing what Matt said, is participating more authentically with the community.
So one other thought on that is, I think you should invite Matt to talk to you guys about how the legal age of voting was established. Oregon had a role to play in that, and I actually think there's a legitimate conversation to be had about whether the legal age should be 18. Maybe it should be lower.
Yeah,
Or 21. What is the age?
18.
18, okay, that's what I thought.
Drinking
I
is
was like,
21,
wait, am I
voting is
drinking or
18,
voting?
so.
Or doing both. But we really haven't had a conversation about that age and whether changes in technology and the way we educate young people and the responsibilities they have, we should question that. And I think it would be great if you engaged Matt, and I would love to be a fly on the wall to hear that conversation.
Let's go
Yeah,
with
I'm
the next
available.
question. Thanks.
Winwakala
I just
City.
voluntold you, Matt, sorry, dude.
I'm into it.
Winwakala City Club member. I have things in common with quite a few of you guys. I'm a PERS retiree. I miss the licorice ice cream at Tillamook. And I taught a human trafficking class at U of O for 7 years. But my question is, as a lesson to these young kids and all of us, what is the one thing that was hardest problem for you, and how did you turn it into something good? You must have faced some huge problem, and you overcame it.
Anybody?
Yeah, I think that, I think you mean like in life generally, not just in this past year. I probably came out to my family as a gay man in my sophomore year in college, and it was a problem for my family. And yet that experience informed so much of my life, because I got engaged, right, with the LGBT group on my college campus. I actually worked on one of my first campaigns back in California when, this was in 1996, when, Hawaii had passed the same-sex marriage law that then got, the backlash happened across the country, for those of you who remember, and I was involved in organizing around that in California. And honestly, I think at one point in my life, I wondered whether I could have a successful career because I was gay. And it turned out that all of the connections I made by just sort of saying, well, this is actually who I am, and these are my beliefs, and this is how I'm going to fight for myself and people around me, has led to, I think, a career beyond my wildest dreams.
I'm going to echo that as well. As a ESL student years ago, and I remember still, like, my high school teacher would call me with somebody with an English or a second language problem. I always saw that as a negative thing until I realized that my diversity is contributing to the richness of my community. So if I were speaking to the young people in the room, I would say embrace that diversity.
Let's get another question in. We've got another young person here who wants to.
Hi. So my question is, how do you feel about teens having a voice and an opinion in today's society?
Great.
+1.
I missed it. Could you repeat the question again? So
How do you feel about teens having a voice or opinion in today's society?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely essential. There's not only have we created a lot of problems that you're going to have to fix, so you might as well start weighing in on those already. That idealism that we talked about before, the optimism and the fact that you're going to be here in the future for a lot longer than we are, and therefore own it more than we do. Is absolutely essential to keeping us on track in terms of priorities, and we've talked a lot about it today, but diversity of perspectives brought to any situation, whether that be age or other experiences and factors, it makes for better solutions. So please.
I would add that American society has hit a number of constraints at once. We can't keep polluting our environment. We know that climate change is real. We can't keep spending without consequence. We know that we are now borrowing from your earnings in the future. We cannot continue to mistreat each other because we know the entrenched division will not solve our problems. As adults, we are struggling with vision. We're struggling to imagine a new future. And hitting this series of constraints in our society, we need your input. It's not that we want it or that we're going to deliver problems to you, but we need your new ideas, your new thinking, your foresight, your imagination, your energy, your vitality to help us get over this series of constraints. And the ability to get through those constraints, the innovation that it will take, is what will grow the country, will grow our economy, will draw us closer to one another. So it's not just that we want to hear your voices, it's that we absolutely need your voices in order to make it past these constraints that we're all facing together.
Let's hear from the next civic scholar.
Hello. By establishing connections between political and social issues, how could we use those connections to create a sort of ripple effect to change all of them?
I would say you're looking you're looking at each other. I mean, I think in some ways when we talked earlier, and Rakaya mentioned her admiration for the young people from Stoneman Douglas, and after that incident happened in their high school, they really banded not just together, but they did use the network effect to really amplify that voice and really build a movement across the country to address the gun issue. So if you're looking at that as a model to really unify each other and unify with each other, I think that's a way to really kind of take advantage of the structures that you could build on your own and to connect with like minds.
We've got time for one more question, so let's get the last scholar here. For those of you listening on the radio, it's impressive how many of the young people lined up to ask the questions.
Hello. I know a lot of weight is held on our shoulders to create change and to be proactive enough to ensure that change. And our hope is held in meetings like this and coming together to talk about these issues. But what is your roles in creating change?
A good question to end on. Each of you, quickly, what are your roles? What do you see your role as in creating change for the good?
Well, I allocate a lot of capital around the world. And I think the role that I can play is to be as honest about the consequences and externalities that we create as we invest money around the world, and to create mechanisms for the next generation to change that. Right? I'm responsible to you, and I understand that in investing, we drive outcomes, and I want to be responsible as I can in doing that work.
So as we started with the first question, the private sector has a really important role to play in addressing some of the important issues facing us in the future. And you know, I think not only can I help to bring some of the resources of the private sector, but start to, as we discussed earlier, break down some of the barriers that are preventing the private and public sectors from working together more effectively.
That is a great question, especially at the end on, so thank you. I think my role, looking at journalism, again, as a role in University of Oregon, is to really think about how do we disrupt the process of how we produce journalism today to how we will produce it in the future, and that really is authentically engaging with communities, so that we build on-ramps so that the community and citizens are actually participating in that process, so that the voices are heard, so that they're actually within the news reports, and we're authentically connect with them to really address everyone's concerns of how they want to live.
Yeah, and in my role, I think I see it as, you know, using the ACLU and the law to push our justice system, be it criminal or civil, into a better future, right? That our laws aren't static; they're malleable, and we should always be pushing the law to change and grow and adapt with our civilization and be more just for everyone.
One of the great moments for me this last year was the appearance here in Portland at the Oregon Historical Society of the great historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. And her lecture gave me hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel that isn't an oncoming train, in her new book, Leadership on Turbulent Times. And as a thank you for our panel here, we have a copy of Doris's new book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, thanking each of you for the leadership you are providing in these turbulent times. So join me in a round of applause for our wonderful panel. Over to President Collin.
Thank you all very much. Our time is up, and we will pause the conversation both for today and for 2018. One more round of applause to thank Mary Margaret Wheeler-Weber for producing today's program, Civic Scholars from Park Rose for participating, and Carrie Tomchuk for serving as our moderator, and our panelists for their thoughtful perspectives. Thank you.